The reader sees 1930s Paris through the eyes of the Americans trying to find their way there. The authenticity of the city's history is made gaudy by the pretensions of the flocking tourists and wannabe artists that circulate Montmartre. We are guided through these small vignettes back to Wyatt, who, after 2 years spent in Munich, now lives outside of the artistic community, painting his model, Christiane, by night and walking the streets in a dishevelled haze by day. While preparing for an exhibition of his work, Wyatt has an encounter with the mysterious art critic Kremer. Kremer offers Wyatt a good review in exchange for 10% of the profits earned by the exhibit. Wyatt refuses and dooms himself to a poor review, earning him nothing for his work. Wyatt decides to leave Paris and the art world behind him. Before he leaves, the news breaks that a new painting by Memling has been discovered, only this wasn't a real Memling at all, but an imitation Wyatt had made while studying in Germany. The second chapter of the Recognitions is a relatively short one, especially when one considers that it is sandwiched between two much larger and more obviously significant episodes. Yet it would be wrong to dismiss it as a simple filler to show what happened to Wyatt during his time in Europe. The attuned and attentive reader, however, will find plenty to sink their teeth into here, especially regarding Gaddis's humour, his views on Americans abroad, Wyatt as subject slowly losing his mind in search of recognition. Here we will also find the tale of two real-world forgers and the parallels between their mischief and the story in our hands. As always, this is a video companion to a much larger project being explored on my Substack and my Patreon. If you would like to see this chapter explored in greater detail, then I suggest you check out my free Substack issue on the topic. This issue's bonus essay is a more in-depth look at the story of forgers Denis Vrain-Lucas and Hans van Meegeren. Perhaps, and this is very likely, I have been in the Gaddis mire for far too long, and I find myself laughing hysterically at everything he says, but what strikes me initially is just how funny this chapter is, especially in how it portrays the Americans in Paris. Gaddis, instead of choosing to start the chapter with Wyatt directly, guides the reader around the city of Paris through the eyes of various American expats who are woven into the esoteric tapestry of dense illusions which Paris allows one to make. They are ignorant of this, however, instead appearing more and more interested in how they themselves are perceived by others, how they are recognised, usually as intellectual or artistic aesthetes. She would have said of that rising tower, the sentence prepared in her mind if anyone had encouraged conversation by sitting down at her table. No one did. Anyone could see it was transitions she was reading, if any had looked. No one did. Finally an unshaven youth bowed slightly, as with pain, murmured something in American, and paused with a dirty hand on the back of a chair at her table. There's something of the sense in which the self only exists if it is acknowledged as such by another going on here. In this instance, the woman is artificially creating the self she wants to be recognised as, and the supreme irony, of course, is that no one seems to care. She reads the most chic magazine, Transition, an international quarterly for creative experiment which ran from 1927 to 1938. She has prepared supposedly witty anecdotes about art, architecture and history, but the only person who speaks to her is another apparently American figure who also isn't interested in engaging her. The woman, in aspiring to an imaginary ideal of what a middle-class American in Paris is supposed to be, is engaged in an act which severs her capacity for a genuine experience of a genuine Paris, leaving her mostly ignored by and unrecognised by her surroundings. Gaddis does attempt to diagnose the condition of the American expat a few pages later. Baffled by the grandeur of their own culture which they could not define and so believed did not exist, these transatlantic visitors had learned to admire in this neatly parcelled definition of civilization the tyrannous pretension of many founded upon the rebellious efforts of a few. The ostentation of thousands presumed the strength of a dozen, who had from time to time risen against this vain complacence with the past to which they were soon to contribute, giving with their harried deaths ground for vanity of language, which they had perfected. Gaddis is defining the relationship between Americans and Europe, particularly Paris in this instance, as one which has emerged out of the American cultural identity hanging in a state of flux. Yet Gaddis presents the idea of these people fleeing from a cultural wasteland and into a quote-unquote authentic culture is a falsity. America, in Gaddis's narration, has culture, it has grandeur, but because it has not been adequately recognised and defined by its citizens, it presents as having nothing to offer at all. Europe, alternatively, has an image of culture which has been carefully curated over centuries. This image of Europe isn't fake per se, but it is the product of the work of a small number of individuals brought to the level of a culture. Culture is here a product of the rebellious efforts of a few, or the dozens who had from time to time risen against this vain complacency with the past, whose efforts have then been claimed by the tyrannous pretensions of many. The Americans want to have a piece of that. They want to join themselves onto a culture where the hard work, that of the rebellious few changing a stagnating society, has already been done for them. The American culture that Gaddis is writing about here is still being created, and created to the stature of grandeur by the rebellious few, and has yet to be defined in the same way that Europe has. This is why these expats flee, because they do not have the spirit of character to be part of the process of defining what America will be in the 20th century. And what of Wyatt? How does Wyatt fit into all of this? And why does it feel as though we find him the way one might stumble upon an old friend unexpectedly and unplanned in some faraway town? The last we had heard from Wyatt, he was setting off to study painting in Munich. Gaddis briefly introduces just how much time has passed since Wyatt left his family parish. In 3 years he had not written his father, and after a year in Paris he had finished 7 pictures, working with a girl named Christiane, a blonde model with small figure and features. We can infer from this that Wyatt has spent 2 years studying in Munich, but he migrated west to Paris and has been working there for a year. This is also a very different Wyatt than we had met previously. In chapter 1, we know that Wyatt was chronically incapable of completing any painting at all, and the only relationships we see him have with women are those with the memory of his dead mother and his dead Aunt May. It's probably not surprising to any reader that Wyatt hasn't written to his father in these 3 years, the previous chapter being so devoted to the irreparable distance growing between them, but the details about his painting and his allowing another woman into his life are notable changes in character. It is, however, telling that these 7 completed paintings are of Christiane. Some of Guillaume's last genuine advice to Wyatt is to finish the painting of his mother, or else it will continue to haunt him. Christiane's reality, her physical presence in Wyatt's life, allows him to complete the process of rendering her into art. There's no absence with Christiane as there is with Camilla. The absence of Camilla fills Wyatt with a sense that he can never produce the perfect representation of her. She is elusive. Christiane is present, and Wyatt can produce the work that he needs to do. It's almost the same as his work painting reproductions. He can reproduce Christiane because she exists to make a copy of. Recreating Camilla would mean engaging with an active imagination which could never perfectly represent the reality. Wyatt paints all night and walks the street by day in a sort of manic haze. This is beautifully rendered by Gaddis's narration. Walking home alone, the cold bearing and the dead weight of anxiety, the sense of something lost. Passing people closely, he passed them with wonder, as though he'd seen no one in years, looking into every face as though hoping to recognise something there. Here, Wyatt has seemingly become his father. the reader should be able to recognise a similar sort of decline to what was seen in Guion in the first chapter. Wyatt, enveloped in his art, is completely isolated from the social world at large. It's unclear why exactly he has become completely incapable of forming human connections, of recognising something there in the other. While one can point back to what has previously been discussed about the trauma of the absent mother figure, this seems to have taken a more extreme form than we last saw it. It is as though in finally being able to find a subject he can complete artistically, he has sacrificed genuine human connection, in much the same way that his father had been consumed in his literature. Note, something is lost. Even in his new way of life, away on a new continent, away from his stifling and collapsing familial tradition, Wyatt cannot overcome the absence which haunts him and which he cannot resolve in the strangers on the street. The final element which feels essential to bring to the fore is the way in which Gaddis describes Wyatt's relationship to time compared to that of those around him. The streets, when he came out, were filled with people recently washed and dressed, people for whom time was not a continuum of disease, but relentless repetition of consciousness and unconsciousness, unrelated as day and night, or black and white, good and evil, in independent alternation, like the life and death of insects. Gaddis makes a contrast between Wyatt and the people recently washed and dressed, and it certainly doesn't paint Wyatt's mental situation in the brightest of light. What does it mean for someone to feel time as a continuum of disease? It is presented as an alternative to the mundane, relentless repetition of consciousness and unconsciousness, but that does not mean that it is a better experience of life. Wyatt's life has done away with the binary experience which helps define the boundaries between the waking world and the unconscious. Wyatt's day and night have collapsed into a manic plane alternating, where he paints and he wanders without the distinctions that make up normal lives. Wyatt's circumstance being equated to a disease, especially in relation to the prior anecdote about his erratic behaviour as he walks around the streets, desperately attempting to recognise something human in strangers, paints a picture of a man in severe mental decline. No wonder then that his encounter with Crimea at the end of the chapter takes this mysterious otherworldly quality that it does. Wyatt is losing his mind, and he's also losing his faith in the legitimacy of the art world's connection to genuine art, and this is what ultimately drives him to leave Paris at the end of the chapter. As always, I'd like to remind you that this is only a small part of a much larger project being undertaken on both my Substack and my Patreon. For more in-depth analysis and for access to all of my research notes, please consider checking them out if you are interested. If you want to help my channel out, please consider leaving a like, a comment or subscribe in order to keep up with all of my uploads. Next time we will be taking a look at Chapter 3, which is a much larger chapter and one which introduces a number of significant characters that we will be tracking throughout the rest of the novel. I hope you will consider joining us, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.